Samuel Adler's book on orchestration has become somewhat of the college standard book for orchestration.
Possibly the greatest state-of-the-art orchestration manual. The Study of Orchestration by Samuel Adler.
This is the one that is used the most by conservatories and colleges. Very well written. This is currently the most comprehensive and up-to-date book on orchestration out there, so I would recommend this 100%. Stay away from the first edition because that one actually had a lot of mistakes in it.
Now, per my usual MO, I decided to take a look and see what was said about the horn to check for accuracy. From the horn's range, to mutes, to use and history of the Wagner Tuba, well, there's plenty to talk about here, so without further ado, let's take a look into the Study of Orchestration by Samuel Adler. Now, full disclosure, even though the text is supposed to be mostly the same, I do not have access to the latest edition of this book that was released in 2016, so there is a chance that some of this information I'll cover has been updated. But from what I can find, the changes in the 4th edition are more about the additional material and not what's changing in there already from the 3rd edition.
The 3rd edition has expanded on many topics with additional information and perspectives. The 4th edition takes these expansions and works them into the fabric of the text more smoothly, while adding more useful thoughts and a final polish to the writing. In fact, overall there's a sense of final reorganization and reshaping of the text.
If you do have the latest edition and can double check my findings and post about it below, that'd be awesome. To start out, Adler mentions that the horn might have been called French due to composers favoring the French designation at the time around the early 1700s. Now, this is a new explanation for me, but I can actually back it up further as well. There's a famous story about Count Spork from Bohemia. He came to Paris and heard one of Jean-Baptiste Lully's operas and loved the sound and use of the horn so much that he had 2 individuals, Wenzel Sveda and Peter Rulig, hopefully that's how they're pronounced, had them stay behind and learn the technique of this instrument and bring it back. Unfortunately, no rep from Lully has survived to my knowledge, but the style can be observed in Bach's Brandenburg Concerto and the Double Concerti by Vivaldi, all written in the early 1700s. With this information, it gives a small origin story to the horn in France, but really, we actually don't know why it's called French, and for this reason, I don't call it French. To support this comment regarding the sounds of horn compared to the trumpet, take a listen to 2 different recordings of this aria from a Bach cantata. Moving forward to the range of the natural horn, we have our first odd claim that is easily researched and proven incorrect. The mistake is this, quote, "Most classical composers seldom ask the horn player to produce any pitch above the 12th partial. From Beethoven on, however, partials up to the 16th were commonly used," end quote. There are actually multiple parts to this. First, taking it at face value, yes, many composers typically would top out at the 12th partial. Even some of the higher horn parts from these composers don't go above the 12th partial. But of course, this isn't always true, and we can prove that by looking at commonly known horn rep, like the Bach Brandenburg Concerto in B minor Mass with plenty of the 16th partial. The Mozart Horn Concerti have the 16th partial, Beethoven 3 with the 16th, so I guess that means it should be the 16th, not the 12th, right? Well, no, I still kind of agree with the 12th, and that brings us to the second part of this error, the key of the instrument. As talked about on the next page of the book, there are many different crooks to change the key of the horn, and just because you change the length of the instrument doesn't mean that the same partials are of equal difficulty. Using a modern triple horn, if I put all my valves down, increasing the length of my instrument from 6 feet on the open high F to about 17 on the low F with all 3 valves down, just about triples the length. So the logical fallacy here would say that I could play about an octave and a half higher on the open high F horn. But my range is actually the same. All this to say that while composers might have topped out at the 12th partial for the most part, the 12th partial could actually be an octave different, like these two notes. The first from Brahms' 4th Symphony and the second from Haydn 48. Yes, the two notes are in the 12th partial, but given natural horns to be able to change their crooks, no horn player would say these notes are equal. But to also address the 16th partial as the highest partial, no, it's not. It is the typically taught top note for the horn, but there are uses above this as well, especially considering there is a common audition excerpt above this, Haydn 31 having the 20th partial. The highest partial in more commonly performed repertoire would be in Schumann's Concertstück for four horns with the 20th partial. But going back to my argument about partials not being equal, is that note actually easier to play on a descant horn where you'd be on the 10th partial? And actually, if you're curious, here are three recordings. The first on a descant on the 10th partial, the second on a double on the 16th, B-flat horn with the second valve down, and the third on a single F on the 20th partial. The highest partial that I'm aware of is in Haydn 51 with the 21st partial. And yes, it's the 21st and not 22nd because the 11th partial is a sharp F, and doubling it to get an octave higher would be the 22nd partial. But that would be sharp, so the 21st would make more sense. The highest sounding pitch is actually in the Bach aria I played before, but that's only on the 18th partial. The reason this is all important is that some younger composers think all horn players can play up to the 16th partial on a C alto crook, thanks to the teachings of this book. Yeah, that's not accurate. There really needs to be a note explaining that unless you know who you are writing for and have done your research, be cautious about going above the 12th partial on the F horn. Finally, moving on. The sound of hand stopping is different than an open horn is true, but if the composer does it right along with a skilled player, the sound won't be as big as you are led to believe here. There are, of course, pieces like the Haydn Concerti and Weber Concertino that it's harder to mask that sound difference. I'll also note that there's a little bit more to the hand stopping technique, but what's said here is good enough for basic history for non-horn players. For these transposition keys, A-flat and A-basso were pretty rare. I've seen A-flat once and it was for 3 notes total in the piece, and there's also a note here that if basso isn't written, alto is assumed. The opposite is actually true. We assume basso unless otherwise indicated, and extensive research is done for many of the works in C and B to let us know what octave was originally intended. But even then, sometimes conductors prefer a different octave. For A, A-flat, and G, yes, alto is assumed. Some quick examples to disprove Adler here would be from Brahms 3 and 4, Mendelssohn 3, and especially in Beethoven 9, where horns 3 and 4 are marked basso, but horns 1 and 2 aren't. But we play all of this basso. Have we been performing these wrong? I want to note as well that we say B instead of B flat. Even when talking about the double horn, we typically say the B and F side of the horn. When B natural crops up, thanks Brahms, then we say B natural. This establishment of high horn and low horn has somewhat gone away, but there are still players that call themselves high horn or low horn players. This actually cuts your potential jobs in half though, and they're already pretty limited to begin with. I actually had to change from third horn to fourth horn on a job with a last minute sub because this player bitched about only playing high horn parts. Seriously y'all, let's grow up and learn to play it all. Yeah, I'm more of a high horn player, having 6 high horn contracted positions, which is more than that individual, but I had no issues getting my chops ready in 2 days for the fourth horn part. What a baby. Anyway, for an example of that low G2 the book is referring to, since it's not a note on the harmonic series for the natural horn, he is correct that we need to bend the note down. Here's an example from the Beethoven Sonata. I don't know if I fully agree with the reasoning for why valves were slowly adopted. Composers and players were so used to how the natural horn operated that composers weren't sure how to write for the new valved horn effectively, and players didn't want to learn a new way to play their own instrument. Seriously, how many people do you know that are stuck in their ways and won't change? I remember a political cartoon about change that everyone wants it but no one actually wants to change. That idea sounds more likely to me. Also note the amount of purists that we have today about modern film music and how it's not as good as the classics, and film composers just steal from them. Yeah, that train of thought has been around much longer than film. Stravinsky said Vivaldi wrote the same piece 700 times, and critics tried to nail Brahms for lifting from Beethoven. Yeah, people don't change too quickly. Anyway, to really get something to catch on, you need that early adopter to show what the possibilities are. That's where Schumann comes in with his Adagio and Allegro for horn and piano and his Concertstück for 4 horns and orchestra. Both of these were written for the new valved horn. Thanks to this, some composers adopted 2 of them, having 2 natural horns and 2 valved horns in their works. To explain Wagner's role in this is that he treated the valved horns as a way to quickly change crooks. So you get lines like this, where there's no time to change crooks, but plenty of times to change a valve combination. This explanation of high and low parts is pretty good here, but I want to add a note for composers. When you want the horns to play 2 separate melodic lines, place one in horns 1 and 2 and the other in horns 3 and 4. That makes it a little easier for horn players to be together on those parts. There are exceptions, like if the line goes fairly high, but that should not be the default. This section about old notation is mostly correct, but in the professional world, we generally know whether or not it should be old or new based on the composer. It was around World War II that composers changed to new notation except for the Russian composers, but that's the general rule anyway. New composers, as far as I'm aware, are requested to write a new notation as that's what will be assumed. I really want people to nix the transposing and non-transposing mute terminology. Some music stores use that and it causes confusion. The terms we should be using are a regular or a straight mute and a stop mute. That's it, unless you want to get into the difference between metal stop and wood stops. A transposing mute sounds like a mute that transposes your instrument, but that's not actually what it's meant for. The transposing part of the mute is a byproduct of what it's actually doing in the sound that it's creating. This symbol means stopped horn. So either hand stop it or use a stop mute. That makes a whole lot more sense. Also, this explanation of hand stopping is incorrect. A better way would be that the right hand closes off the bell. The reason for this is it actually depends on the player. Most horn players only need to move their hand in slightly into the bell to be able to stop it, but others have to move in their hand more. And it's actually even possible for someone's hands to be too large or too small to be able to stop effectively. Because of the confusing transposing versus non-transposing wording earlier, here it sounds like the stopped passages could be played with either type of mute. I want to add a couple notes here. I am aware that Adler does not mention a stop mute at all, but he still said the non-transposing mute issue, so it's still a part of the problem. But here, since he never mentions a stop mute, he's saying we'll use a mute rather than stopping these passages. That's not true. If it's marked stopped, we are going to stop the horn, either with our hand or with a stop mute. We won't play it with a straight mute. So I don't know why he's adding this here, because that's just not true at all. This is why calling it a stop mute makes so much more sense, as it's used for playing stopped horn passages. So logical. There are occasions where horn players will mute differently than indicated, but I'll keep that our little secret. Okay, fine. For a quick mute changes like here in Elgar's cello concerto, we'll typically play this stopped as the mute change is easier with hand stopping. And Bartók's concerto for orchestra has some impossible changes as well. Then there's this spot in The Sorcerer's Apprentice that is sometimes played muted instead of stopped. And for those in the know, no, I'm not going into echo horn here. While trills can be played with either the valves or the lips, lip trills should be the go-to for horn players. The reason is because many of the notes, like the D and F in the Strauss example here, if you just wiggle your fingers, the pitch won't actually change. As for the G, no matter what you do, it will not be as clean as a lip trill, and the B is to a C, and so that has to be a valve trill. Granted, this is an orchestration book, so all this extra information isn't exactly needed to be known by composers. Glissandi are indeed mostly found going up, but this word about it being infrequent is wrong. Ask any horn player who's played a church gig, especially modern Christmas cantatas. Yeah, they're all over the place. In this season already, I've performed Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra that has a gliss at the end, and I recently did the Firebird as well, which has a glissandi in the finale. They are certainly not infrequent. Of course, they are in film scores as well, so you got this example like Test Drive and How to Train Your Dragon, and here in Silverado.
Oh, this is amazing! The wind in my cheat sheet! Stop!
Moving up to the bells up paragraph, there's so much wrong here. First, there's the school of thought that the bell was placed on the leg for the sound and bells up just meant off the leg. Secondly, placing the bell higher up is honestly just for show. There's literally no difference except it makes it harder to play since we are now in an abnormal position. Now, for the other things wrong here, first the removal of the right hand. My question for Adler would then be, where do we put our right hand? But more importantly, this is just wrong. The right hand stays in the bell. Now, he does say we use the right hand to turn the bell upward to face the audience. Well, first, the audience is in front of the horns, so turning the bell up would not be towards the audience. And second, our bells actually face roughly the same direction as our normal position. And that leads me back to, bells up is just a visual effect. I actually had a conductor say that you couldn't hear a specific horn line unless it was bells up. I'm sorry, that's bullshit. There's actually bells up in the Matrix soundtrack, believe it or not, and that's just silly. Now that we've gone through the entire horn section, the Wagner Tuba has been placed in with the tuba section for some reason, but the errata in here will help explain that. The tuba, as we know it today, was not introduced to the symphony orchestra until around 1875 when Richard Wagner conceived of it and wrote for the instrument. No. First, the patent for the tuba dates back to the 1830s, not by Wagner. Also, Adler contradicts himself with this example from Die Meistersinger, an opera that premiered on June 21st of 1868, and this excerpt from Flying Dutchman, which premiered on January 2nd of 1843. In the additional passages for study, there are multiple pieces in the tuba section by Berlioz, who died in 1869. So how did the tuba not exist in orchestras until 1875? Also, there's another weird thing about the Berlioz pieces that I'll get to in a moment. Back to the paragraph we were reading before, the Wagner tuba was shaped like a horn and had a sound very much like that instrument in a much lower range, therefore provided bass support to the trumpets and trombones. Again, no. First, since we were saying it's like a horn and the next paragraph states it's part of the horn family, then why is it here with the tubas? Second, if you look at the passages for the tubing, you'll see that it was used as another type of horn. And since the horn has a used range of about 4 octaves, so did the tubin. It's the same harmonic series. But to prove the quote bass support wrong, continuing on, this instrument replaced the ophicleide? What? I want to see the sources on this one, Adler. I can find no evidence to support this claim. The only works I know of that we perform today that was originally written for the ophicleide are works by Berlioz, mainly Symphonie Fantastique. Since this is so widely performed, there are plenty of live performances on YouTube to look through for that dies irae and see what instrument is playing the ophicleide part. Let's take a look.
Then unison bassoons and tubas bark out the dies irae, the traditional chant sung at funerals, Day of Wrath.
Not one Wagner tuba. And I honestly showed a lot of examples to show that I wasn't cherry picking. I honestly couldn't find a single performance of that part played on a Wagner tuba. But let's skip ahead for the moment to the section on the ophicleide. Quote, "The tuba has completely replaced this instrument." Now you're just contradicting yourself. Wagner wrote for a new instrument that became known as the Wagner Tuba, but even the month leading up to the premiere, it was not clear on what the instrument was going to be called. In fact, the Wagner Tuba design wasn't solidified for almost another 15 years by the hornmaker Alexander. Another bit of confusion at the time was Wagner's conductor Hans Richter preferred different keys for the Wagner Tuba, B-flat alto and F, where Wagner preferred E-flat and B-flat basso. And yeah, Strauss even wrote for F basso tuba, and to make matters even worse. What's important to know for modern composers though, just write the part in F, same as the F horn. These instruments were usually played by horn players? Why does that phrasing sound familiar?
The Wagner tuba or tuban, it's an instrument that was created for Richard Wagner's ring cycle of operas. It's another transposing brass instrument, often played by a horn player.
I'll let this quote, "not many other composers," comment go, but really the tuban is used in film scores a lot more than you realize, like these examples. The F tuba, which is the same length as the F horn, so don't be confused by the bass wording here, became the standard because of the F horn standardization as far as I know, but B-flat parts do still appear as well. In some places, particularly the United States, the euphonium replaced Wagner's tenor tuba and has often been used to read the latter's part. First, there actually does exist a quote tenor tuba that is not the Wagner tuba. This is a bit confusing, but as far as I know, the tenor tuba is not really used today, but a low brass player will be able to confirm better than I. Second, the euphonium has never replaced the Wagner tuba. There is no evidence of this. There are very specific pieces that were actually written for a tenor tuba. The Planets by Holst was definitely meant for a euphonium and has never been performed on a Wagner tuba aside from Vienna according to Melton, although I cannot find any evidence of this. The two pieces that would seem to support the replacement theory are both Strauss pieces, Don Quixote and Ein Heldenleben. What happened was Strauss changed his opinion on the instrument and in 1919 decided not to write for that instrument again, saying that it had a quote demonic sound and that those two pieces were better played on a tenor tuba or a euphonium, which is what's done today. This excerpt of Don Quixote that is shown seems to prove me wrong. However, take a look at this. When writing for the Wagner tuba, Strauss wrote tenor tuba. What I think happened is that Adler came across certain information. This information said that these pieces that originally were written for the Wagner tuba, they didn't have tubin at the time, and so they used something else. Sometimes a euphonium. And so he made the assumption that the euphonium replaced the Wagner tuba for these pieces. That's not exactly true, it's just because the Wagner tuba weren't available. So if they weren't available, they just used something else at the time. Now, those pieces are not performed today, but if they were, most likely we would perform them on Wagner tubin. This book by Samuel Adler is the college standard for orchestration, but not only has false information, it contradicts itself as well. So be warned if you decide to look through this book and learn about other instruments. At least for the horn, it's not the most accurate, but hopefully I've provided enough evidence and clarifications here.